The unacceptable circumstances surrounding Karina's death inspired legislation called Karina's Bill that will clarify and strengthen the law to require a firearm to be removed when a domestic violence survivor is granted the firearm remedy in an order of protection. When we return to Springfield in January, turning Karina's bill into Karina's law should be our priority.
However, instead of a festive cheer, what we are truly anticipating is the looming lame duck session scheduled for the first week of January. For those less familiar with the term, lame duck session occurs when retiring legislators or those not reelected return to Springfield for one final period of legislative activity. During this time, legislators are no longer accountable to their constituents, raising concerns about their accountability and an integrity to the decisions made. The lame duck session has historically been one of the most risky and concerning periods for the residents of our great state.
That's State Representative Brad Halbrook, and before that, State Representative Didich about what could possibly happen come January 2nd as Illinois lawmakers return for lame duck session. They just wrapped up fall veto session. It was pretty busy this week. Wasn't really anticipating a lot happening, but they did tackle a lot, including anticipating what could be coming up for fall veto session. It's Illinois in Focus Daily. I'm Greg Bishop, waking up with you each and every weekday morning to break down things happening at the State House and how it impacts you. And we've got, of course, fall veto session wrapping up yesterday. A whole bunch was tackled this week. We talked yesterday about some omnibus bills that touched on sunsets, extending sunsets for a variety of public acts, and also doing a bunch of changes with recent tax code that they implemented during the spring. Seeing some headlines on how that's impacting a city like Chicago, for instance, especially when it comes to a cell phone fee that they included in the budget, but now they're taking that back as they work to tweak it a bit more. But that could mean some budgetary issues for the city of Chicago. They've already got a whole host of budgetary issues. But some of the other things that they passed included a measure about saying, hey, if you want a name change, you don't have to publish that in a newspaper. Here is State Senator Ram Vilivalam during a Senate committee this week talking about his measure that did ultimately get across the finish line.
House Bill 5164 eliminates the requirement to publish a name change with a local newspaper. This is legislation that passed the House in the spring with 67 votes. It's legislation that 24 states already have in place. These 24 states do not require publication.
So Vilivalam essentially wanting to say, hey, if somebody wants to change their name, they don't have to put it in the newspaper. They still have to go to the courts and go through that, but no longer, if the governor signs this measure, will have to be published. He tried to get ahead of some of the criticisms he anticipated on this bill.
Just preemptively answering the questions in terms of how would authorities detect criminal activity or fraud. First, the name change law already requires folks with criminal records to disclose that information when filing their name change petition with the judge. Second, fraud and criminal records are detected through Social Security or driver's license numbers. Those identifiable numbers stay the same when a person changes their name. An individual with a criminal conviction has their fingerprints on file with law enforcement. Fingerprints do not change when someone changes their name.
Interesting. Good line of argument there. But Republicans worried there's a massive loophole. State Senator Sue Rezin had this to say. And fire away. Go.
And in the definition of who falls under this act would be people here that are non-citizens that have come over from other countries. And my concern is that people who are participating in criminal activities, part of gangs, will use this process to change their name and forever be hidden in the system, because we know how long it takes all of the system to catch up anytime there's a change. Just because they change it all takes a while. So I just want to make sure that we, especially people on my side, understand that we feel that this definitely there's a loophole built into a bill that maybe started off good, but potentially is helping people who are here as non-citizens, especially the criminals.
So she mentioned some non-citizen criminals that brought in some fentanyl and were caught in her district. She said it was enough to kill a sizable amount of people. But obviously Republicans raising those concerns. Senate President Don Harmon, leading the Democrats in the Illinois Senate, didn't buy that.
I have to follow up that parade of horribles with a question. Is there any world in which a non-resident, non-citizen with no paperwork and no connection to the state of Illinois can walk in and ask for a name change? What would they be changing? There's no record of them in their name.
No.
So a simple, answered and asked question during committee, and that measure did ultimately pass. So it's onto the governor's desk. Meanwhile, the Senate also passed a measure onto the governor's desk that would eventually phase out the sub-minimum wage for workers with developmental disabilities. And here is the sponsor of that legislation in the Illinois Senate, Christina Castro, Democrat out of Elgin.
House Bill 793 creates the Dignity and Pay Act, which does the following. Requires HFS and DHS file an amendment to the Home and Community-Based Services Waiver Program for adults with developmental disabilities to increase the rate for small group support waivers. Requires the Department of Human Services establish a Section 14C subminimum wage certificate transition program to award grants that will support community agencies in creating competitive integrated employment opportunities and programming for people with developmental disabilities in transitioning away from the subminimum wage for persons with developmental disabilities. Requires the Employment and Economic Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities Task Force to develop a multi-step plan to assist the state in phasing out 14C certificates and the subminimum wage for persons with developmental disabilities on or after December 31st, 2029. 18 other states, as well as the city of Chicago, have begun to phase out this process to provide dignity to those who are disabled, to put a human face to say that those folks who are developmentally disabled are worth more than a subminimum wage, to show their value as humanity.
So Castro getting this measure across the finish line, but not without some opposition. State Senator Jill Tracy, Republican from Quincy, raised concerns about what this means for the economic conditions that allow for people who have developmental disabilities with different productivity levels to be able to have that dignity of work.
This bill would go into effect regardless of productivity level, That's why I oppose this bill, is because I think we have to somehow accommodate those that aren't going to be able to meet the productivity levels that allow a business to contract with, say, a private provider like Valley House Shelter to keep these workers employed. There has to be a balance. It's about productivity. It's about your bottom margins when you're an employer. If they have to pay minimum wage, will they take the work away? So
clearly concerns there that if the sub-minimum wage is phased out in 2029, what's that going to mean for employers that take advantage of that program to give jobs to people with developmental disabilities who have different levels of productivity? But if it's all of a sudden they have to be paid the minimum wage, which starting January 1st this coming new year will be $15 an hour in Illinois. Compare that to other states, our neighboring states. State Senator Chapin Rhodes, a Republican from Mahomet, shared those concerns.
Here's what happens when you're up against Indiana. And the entire 51st Senate District, well, not the entire, but we border Indiana for multiple counties. Indiana's minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. From Paris, Illinois to Terre Haute is about 20 minutes. At $15 an hour, you just put all those folks that this bill is designed to help out of business. Out of work, pink slipped.
So obviously, regardless of the concerns, the measure is onto the governor's desk, who indicated he would sign it. So that's what happened in the Senate yesterday. Of course, yesterday was the final day of fall veto session, and it was pretty busy in the Senate, well, at least for one bill. The House really didn't do anything. They gavelled in some points of personal privilege, and then they gavelled out. Before they gavelled in and out, you had some back and forth with Democrats pushing for more gun control measures. Here's State Representative Dan Didich.
I rise today to honor the life of Dr. Olga Duchan, a resident of Vernon Hills whose life was taken from her earlier this week. I'll read from a GoFundMe page that was established by her friend. We are heartbroken to share the tragic news that Dr. Olga Duchan, a beloved physician and radiant soul, was murdered on Sunday. Olga, who dedicated her life to caring for others, leaves behind her cherished 4-year-old daughter. Tragically, Olga's life was cut short by an act of domestic violence, a harrowing reminder of the dangers that many face in silence. Her loss is not just a personal tragedy. It highlights the urgent need to confront and address domestic violence in our communities. From news reports, a 46-year-old Barrington man has been charged with first-degree murder in the shooting death of a well-regarded North Suburban endocrinologist over the weekend, police said. The assistant state's attorney told the judge the couple's relationship ended in 2021 over Duchan's objections to the defendant purchasing and storing firearms in their home. Duchan obtained an order of protection against the defendant, which required him to surrender his firearms. That order revoked his firearm owner's identification card. We have seen this tragic story before. Many of you are familiar with the case of Karina Gonzalez. Almost a year and a half ago, Karina and her 15-year-old daughter were shot and killed by Karina's husband, even though she had been granted an order of protection against him. The unacceptable circumstances surrounding Karina's death inspired legislation called Karina's Bill that will clarify and strengthen the law to require a firearm to be removed when a domestic violence survivor is granted the firearm remedy in an order of protection. We advanced similar legislation last year. Since then, progress has stalled as conversations among stakeholders have continued to iron out the details of the bill. I understand that this is a complex issue, but the time to get this done is now. On this issue, we should be doing less talking and more voting. Our job is to make laws. By continuing to do nothing, we're making orphans. When we return to Springfield in January, turning Karina's bill into Karina's law should be our priority.
So again, Didich making the call that when they return January 2nd, they should move forward to get Karina's bill, a bill that would essentially allow for local law enforcement to confiscate firearms from individuals who have protective orders against them. And these issues are obviously things that people are pointing to recent U.S. Supreme Court precedents that require hearings if somebody's rights are going to be taken away. And some of these protective orders, there's not really a hearing where the individual who's facing some kind of order against them has a chance to face their accuser, right? So how that's going to work out, I guess we'll see. But clearly, it's something that Democrats like State Representative Dan Didich are focused on trying to get accomplished during lame duck session. State Representative Jeff Kiker, Republican from Sycamore, responded to Didich.
I don't mean my comments in any way to take away from the tragedy that my peer just shared with the dearly departed doctor from Vernon Hills. But just as President-elect Trump has indicated that there are 1.3 million deportation orders that have already been made for residents that are still here, I'd like to point out that there are also low-hanging fruit when it comes to revoked FOID cards. Just this year, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart indicated that there are 27,000 revoked FOID cards in Cook County alone, where those households more than likely still possess firearms, and we have done nothing to address that. What we do instead is we go after law-abiding gun owners who are just minding their own business and doing nothing nefarious. And again, I don't mean to take away from the tragedy, but let's do as President-elect Trump has suggested and pursue the low-hanging fruit of those that shouldn't have it already. And let's eradicate some of those burdens from possible domestic violence situations.
So how this is going to be handled come veto session, while veto session's over, come lame duck session, we'll be keeping an eye on that. So be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell with America's Talking Network and wake up with us as we review what happens here in Springfield on the ground with reporting through thecentersquare.com. State Representative Brad Halbrook, to wrap up fall veto session, he had some warnings that he wanted to put out there for the state's residents.
Ladies and gentlemen of the General Assembly, as we conclude the final week of veto session, there is a palpable sense of anticipation in the air, almost akin to excitement being felt by a child awaiting Christmas morning. However, instead of a festive cheer, what we are truly anticipating is the looming lame duck session scheduled for the first week of January. For those less familiar with the term, lame duck session occurs when retiring legislators or those not reelected return to Springfield for one final period of legislative activity. During this time, legislators are no longer accountable to their constituents, raising concerns about their accountability and an integrity to the decisions made. The lame duck session has historically been one of the most risky and concerning periods for the residents of our great state. But why is that the case? Well, there's lots of evidence to that point. In January 2021, the Safety Act was rushed through the Senate in the wee hours of the morning onto the House and then was signed by the governor. This legislation has since become one of the most contentious and litigated bills to emerge from our General Assembly. It required multiple subsequent bills to address its flaws, resulting in more amendments than the original text itself, not to mention the numerous lawsuits challenging its constitutionality. Fast forward to January of 2023, we saw the introduction of Protect Illinois Communities Act. Similar to the Safety Act, PICA was pushed through quickly, deemed unconstitutional by many, yet still signed into law, and just recently was struck down by a federal judge. This pattern leaves law-abiding taxpayers to defend their civil rights in court against their own state, bearing the financial and emotional burdens of these legislative oversights. The lame duck session is fertile ground for rushed and ill-considered legislation. The examples of Safety Act and PICA demonstrate how critical policies can be compromised when accountability is diminished. Beyond rush policies, there are significant concerns about the constitutionality of these laws passed during these sessions. These laws not only face legal challenges, but also undermine the very principles that are meant to uphold. We have seen such legislation that attacks fundamental rights, such as free speech, during regular sessions under the guise of protecting the most vulnerable among us. But lame duck is always worse. Governor Pritzker has repeatedly claimed to have balanced budgets and created a rainy day fund. However, the reality tells a different story. Illinois once again is facing multi-billion-dollar deficits. The financial strain is largely due to continued pandemic-era spending. However, the difference now is there's no federal bailout money coming with it. The projected $23 billion increase in the state's budget by 2030 is unsustainable and places an undue burden on taxpayers without cuts. Furthermore, the outmigration of Illinois citizens is a clear indicator that these policies are driving residents away rather than fostering a thriving community. Governor Pritzker, it's time to acknowledge the realities facing Illinois. Our state is losing more citizens than ever before, and your policies are a significant contributing factor. To this body, let's not make any worse decisions during lame duck session by ramming through more policies that will drive people out of Illinois. We must restore common sense to our state's governance. In closing, the upcoming lame duck session presents another dangerous opportunity for misguided legislation that could further jeopardize our state's future. Let's not continue repeating the vicious cycle of radical, unconstitutional legislation passed during lame duck. Let's stand united in advocating for responsible governance, accountability, and the preservation of our constitutional rights. together, we can return Illinois to a place of prosperity and opportunity for all citizens.
Again, that's State Representative Brad Halbrook sharing some of his concerns for the upcoming lame duck session, as fall veto session is now in the books. So hopefully you are more informed about what's going on at the Illinois Statehouse and the concerns of a lame duck session, given that we had the end of cash bail pass in lame duck session of 2021, and we have the state's gun and magazine ban passed during lame duck session of 2023. And here we are now getting ready for lame duck session 2025 with all kinds of things that could pop. From more gun control laws to possibly some tax increases. Who knows? We'll be watching it, so be sure to wake up with us. America's Talking Network. Click that notification bell. Get the podcast where you get podcasts, Illinois in Focus Daily, and subscribe to the newsletter at thecentersquare.com.